Sonia Hainstone Center for Black Culture and History and our annual African Diaspora Lecture. This program is probably one of the oldest standing programs of the Sonia Hainstone Center. It goes back to about 1988. So in a lot of ways, it remains one of the kind of signature programs that we have, along with several other projects and programs that we do on an annual basis. The reason this is so important for us is because this was one of the first programs, at least within the broader field of African American studies, that began focusing on the diaspora, or the notion that there were connections between people of African descent, regardless of where they were in the world, whether it's the Caribbean, whether Latin America, or South America, whether it's in India, Australia, or wherever the far-flung diaspora happens to be. We are very, very fortunate today to have a very, very special guest with us, someone that we've wanted to bring down for some time, and fortunately, one of our board members, Michael Terry, had a very, very close connection and was able to do that inside job for us. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Michael to come up and to introduce our speaker for today. And once again, thanks to all of you for coming out on a wonderful 73-degree day to hear a special speaker that we have for you. Thank you once again.
Good evening. As Joseph said, my name is Michael Terry. I teach in the Linguistics department here at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Lisa Green from the University of Massachusetts. Dr. Green does work on a wide variety of topics related to African American English. She does work in formal syntax, has published in semantic work on African American English, and she is the founder and director of the Center for the Study of African American Language at the University of Massachusetts. Tonight, her topic is dialects in the marketplace, language, education, identity, and attitudes.
Thank you so much. So I want to just spend some time talking about dialects tonight. I want to talk in general about just general American dialects, and then I want to move on to speak more specifically about one dialect in particular. But I guess I want to start just by getting you to think about dialects and the kinds of images they conjure. So what do you think of when you think or hear dialects, or the word dialect? A number of things: stigmatized features, non-standard language. Perhaps you think of, it's the other speech. They speak a dialect. Perhaps then you may think slang. Okay, slang. This is not standard English, mainstream English, it's slang. Still yet you might think, well, you know, it's acceptable speech, but it's used in informal contexts. And then you might also think, well, dialects indeed are separate languages. Just like any other language, like Spanish, French, dialects are indeed separate languages. So there are a number of views that we have about dialects, and I want to just spend some time talking about those particular views. The focus then is basically what we have here. How then are these views about dialects and American English guiding us? So in particular, what then do we think about language and language use? How are our views about dialects guiding us in making decisions about education? And then what's the relationship between dialects and identity? And then what are our attitudes toward dialects? So these are a number of issues that come up when we think in terms of language. Often I talk just about the structure of language, what speakers actually do in forming sentences. But tonight I'm going to step out of my comfort zone and talk about some of these other hot issues, hoping that I can bring the structure and some of these issues together to give us more insight into the nature of dialects. So when we think in terms of dialects of American English, we think in terms of, for example, Appalachian English. We think in terms of Southern English, and Southern is very big. We also might think in terms of African American English, known by a number of other names, but I'll only refer to it as African American English. And we also think in terms of Outer Banks English. And the list goes on and on and on. But we want to single those out because they're distinct And there are certain patterns and systems that distinguish these particular varieties or dialects. So in characterizing dialects, there are a number of ways we can do that. We can define a dialect basically by talking about the speakers. Who actually speaks this particular variety? We might say, well, a dialect then is basically a variety that's spoken by people who are members of the working class. Maybe a dialect is spoken by people of a particular region or of a certain ethnic group. So that doesn't give us any information about the system itself, but it basically just gives us some idea about who speaks this variety. So I don't know, maybe that means that if you come across one of the persons who might meet the criteria there, you might think that that person speaks a particular dialect. But you don't really know anything about the dialect itself. Another way we can actually characterize or define a dialect is by features. We might say, well, this is a dialect, and in this dialect, certain kinds of features are used. For example, it may be a variety in which there's no overt is or are form. So speakers might very well say, she reading too fast, they in the kitchen, as opposed to they are in the kitchen, or she's reading too fast. So we might pick out particular features that characterize a dialect. We also then might think in terms of a kind of dual components characterization. We might say, well, American English dialects are basically varieties that are formed with two components. One component, general American English, and the other component is unique. And that little unique component is responsible for coloring or flavoring general American English, such that general American English takes on a different flavor when we have those separate unique features. Okay? So here then is yet another way to think about dialects. This is quite intuitive, because if we think in terms of Appalachian English, African American English, we might say that those particular varieties share something in common, and that is that they have patterns or features of general English, but they are distinguished because each may have a different kind of feature. So for example, in one of these varieties, intonational patterns, stress patterns may be unique. So speakers may be able to say, oh, she's been married. They may be able to stress been to give a certain meaning about a long time. Speakers may be able to use rhythm and intonation to indicate questions without actually doing anything else with the sentence structure. So then dialects then may be taken to be actually a unit that's composed of two different components. We're going to throw that definition out, but it's very nice to talk about it. The definition, though, the characterization that I have in mind when I talk about dialects in general, African American English in particular, is what you see there. So everything that I say tonight will be based on this particular characterization. Dialects, then, are varieties that have set rules of sound patterns, set rules of word formation, set rules of sentence structure, and meaning. So dialects then aren't haphazard. They have real structure, real system, real patterns, real principles. I mean, we already know that, but I want to be able to just take steps to really, really get you to see that. So this notion then of having set systems and patterns is just really very ingrained in dialects, as it is in languages in general. It's so ingrained such that there are actually slang components to dialects, to languages. All of you know some slang. Let me see the hand of somebody who knows absolutely no slang. Just not, who knows nothing? Not one. Who knows one slang element? Who knows at least one? Somebody's not voting here. Who knows at least one slang element? You know, oh yes ma'am.
Everybody knows at least one. Is that what you mean?
Yeah,
more than one.
Do you know one at least? At least one?
Yeah.
Oh yes, oh she knows one. Do you know one, sir? Well, oh, what's up? I can't say it as cool as you. You're really cool. Okay, very nice. Who knows another one? Oh my goodness, I never thought I'd come to such a place. Who knows another one? Oh, what do you know, sir?
When you say element,
I'm sorry?
when you say slang element,
A slang word. Slang word. I just want to have an idea of what you what you have in mind when we say
Well,
slang.
your presentation is crumb.
Oh my goodness! Oh, sir! This is oh, you are just you are my favorite. Oh my goodness! Did you hear that? I'm floored. One more.
She's cool.
She's cool. You guys are way too cool for me. Okay. So these are particular slang elements, and often when we hear dialects, we think in terms of these kinds of elements. But it's really important to note, even when we use that level of language, rules and systems are in operation. So I want to give you a real example of what I mean by applying rules even to the slang component. We already know that dialects and slang are not equal. Dialects and languages have slang components. They all do. But I don't know, I'm sure now you're so cool, I know you're very familiar with the phrase, get your X on. So we have the first element or word there, get. The second one is a possessive pronoun, like your, her, my, his. The next element is X, and that's the slot we're interested in. That's the slot that's filled in with drink, sleep, eat, lean, and so on. And then the very last element in that phrase is on. On, okay? And so basically then we can say that get possessive pronoun X on means something like to X. So get your drink on means something like for you to drink. Get your eat on means something like for you to eat. Get her chill on means for her to rest or relax. So you can't get somebody else's X on. They have to do their own kind of getting on. So that's already a rule that we understand. And 7, I read this in a magazine. I don't know what it is, but it sounds like something I might want to do. Get my hydrotoning on, okay? So for me to engage in hydrotoning. But what I want to show then is that this is a really very productive way of adding more words and phrases to the big dictionary, the lexicon. And speakers then know the particular rules that are involved in doing this. So much so that if you create a weird one, speakers know right off that it's weird. And so let's do a linguistic analysis of this particular construction. So the first thing we want to do is determine what the grammatical class or part of speech is of the X thing. So remember we said get your drink on, get your eat on. So the X thing is drink and eat. So we can actually perform real linguistic analysis to determine what part of speech the X thing is. So if you wanted to go out and be as cool as this gentleman and create a number of these particular structures, then you would understand that I have to do so by using a word that's of a particular grammatical class. So the first thing we know is that in those structures, get your drink on, we see that the X thing, drink, follows a possessive pronoun, your. And we know that when we look at other places in English, when a word follows a possessive pronoun, it's a noun. Your book, your shoes, my finger, my desk, his eyeballs. So then that gives us one clue that that X thing is indeed a noun. And we also see that it occurs in a phrase that follows get your drink on. So we see get your book, get your drink. Often elements that follow this get are noun kinds of things. So here what we see already is that we have an argument to suggest that the X thing and get your groove on, get your X on is a noun. It passes the test of nouns. But if you're not convinced, I can convince you that that thing that you need to insert in the X slot is a noun by looking at B. So one thing we know then is that if it's a noun, it's going to be modified by an adjective. This is what we learned in school. Adjectives modify nouns. So here we can see, for example, get your big book. Book is a noun. It's modified by an adjective, big. We can also say get your heavenly praise on. Heavenly is an adjective modifying praise, really showing us that praise must be a noun. And if you go to movies, you'll also find this construction. What if she did go out and get her little swerve on? Okay, so here we see swerve must be a noun. It's modified by this diminutive lil or little. Okay, and so here we see then that speakers, it's true. You know, when you're in the elevator and you hear a student say, oh, I'm hungry, I gotta get my eat on, get my grub on. It's true. The student isn't thinking, oh, is that a noun? I need to find the right noun. They're not thinking that way, but given the way language works, we know then that that has to be what's going on. But if it is indeed the case that the X slot is actually going to be occupied by a noun, then why don't speakers say, I'm going to get my car on? That sounds a little strange. Oh, who likes that? I'm going to get my, oh, she hates it. Yeah, so if I said I'm going to get my car on, you might think, oh, she doesn't know the rules. So the problem here is that what we see is that it's true that this element has to be a noun, but it has to be also able to be used as a verb. So I can't to car, but I can drink, okay? So car doesn't work because it doesn't have a verbal kinds of properties. So speakers know right off when these constructions are horrible. And this basically shows us that in these particular varieties, even in the slang component, as in languages, rules are being followed, okay? And finally, we can ask what the part of speech is of the entire phrase, get, possessive pronoun, X on. What's the part of speech of get your drink on? Or I'm going to get my chill on. You can basically substitute get my chill on with rest. I'm a rest. I'm going to rest, okay? So it suggests that that whole thing is a verb kind of thing. Rest is a verb. But when I say I'm at the store, it's strange. Because rest then, get my chill on, is actually a verb, the store is a noun. So really then what we want to show is that even when we have these views that dialects and slang are the same, we're saying a great deal there. Slang then isn't sort of messed up language. It too follows rules, and we can see these rules. So now then, so in general, so those are general points about American English, but now what I want to do is be a bit more specific, and I want to shine the light on African American English. So now I'm going to be a bit more specific about this particular variety. So now, one of the questions one has to ask, I know I would have asked you, okay, African American English again. Why are we talking about this yet once more? So if you think back to the 60s, what we saw in talking about this particular variety, okay, was the deficit hypothesis. And the deficit hypothesis said that people, or in particular children, because it was basically applied to educational contexts, children who spoke this particular variety spoke a non-standard dialect that was a deficient form of language. And given that, they were not able to communicate in complex kinds of thoughts. So that's a deficit hypothesis. But we know that given the rules and systems and patterns, and I'll talk a little bit about acquisition stages of African American English, we know that these children don't have a deficient form of language. In the 1970s, we had what's referred to as the Ann Arbor Black English case in Ann Arbor, Michigan. After a good bit of deliberation, it then was argued that speaking African American English then served as a barrier to equal education because the language that the children actually used differed from the language of the school system, and then the children were not able to participate given their language. But we didn't stop there. 1980s, we saw reports from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And at that point, the claim was that black-white gaps in reading and math had stopped narrowing. There was more distance in the scores between the two groups. But at this point, then, we have to sort of stop and take stock. Because when we talk about African American English, we don't want to equate that with blackness or African Americans. So we're not suggesting that all African Americans speak African American English. So we're not suggesting that language, okay, was responsible for the gaps. But certainly language may have played a role in it for different children. And then we haven't stopped. So in the 1990s, we heard about the Oakland Ebonics controversy. Problematic. For some reason, information was a bit sort of distorted, and so the message that the researchers tried to get across just did not come across. And that was, what if we can use dialects to help children gain mastery of mainstream American English? It just didn't come out that way. So basically then, what we can see here, just by looking at these events. We can see that there's a cycle in the work on African American English, and we just seem to be spinning our wheels. What I want to try to suggest then is that there are directions that we can take that might advance us. And so I think we can get just a bit beyond some of the points we've actually been stuck in. So now I want to come back to this model. And so now you might say, well, okay, I understand what you're saying here about system, African American English. You want to say it's pattern. You want to say it has its syntax, that sentence structure. You want to say it has rules for putting sounds together to form words. You want to talk about the way units are put together to form meaningful kinds of chunks of speech. So you might say, well, what I want to suggest to you is that African American English is just an informal way of speaking general English, just informal. So basically then, what you want to suggest is that, well, okay, when I'm speaking informally, I speak African American English, but when I'm in formal contexts, I move from that and speak something like mainstream English. Okay? And so that view is extremely problematic. So what we have to understand, and we have to think in these terms, we haven't thought in these terms, we have to think in terms of children growing up as native speakers of African American English. So children don't just start to speak African American English at 10 years old. Okay? A child who's 18 months in an African American English speaking community, beginning to develop language, 2, 3, 4, we clearly see patterns of African American English. So by the time the child gets to school, the child has already developed many of the patterns of his or her linguistic system. So it really is problematic to say that African American English is informal English. Because what then you are now suggesting is that these children who are developing this language variety as their native variety only have an informal way of speaking. Can you imagine what that's like? You have a system of speaking and it's simply informal. You never have access to a formal way of speaking. That can't be right. So here we're just going to right now just X this thing out. Okay? This is not the way to look at things. So what we do want to get across is that even in African American English, there are formal ways of using this particular variety. So we can think of African American English on a continuum, and you certainly may have a register of African American English that you use in informal contexts with people in your close social networks. Okay? But you may use a more formal African American English in religious and political kinds of settings. Okay? One has to raise the question of what is formal African American English? Okay? And what's informal African American English? It may very well be, I mean, this is not the topic of the discussion tonight, but it may very well be then that when we talk about formal African American English, what we're suggesting then is that there's a greater focus on rhetorical kinds of strategies, rhythm, intonation kinds of strategies, with perhaps less focus on maybe grammatical patterns in the syntax. But it basically is in existence. So you can think of African American English speakers who are learning to give speeches in church, learning to recite poems in church. The kind of language that they use in church certainly shouldn't be taken as an informal language. It may not be the kind of formal language that you would conduct business with in the marketplace, but it is indeed a formal register of that particular variety. So we are just not going to leave here with this notion that African American English equals informal American English, because that just simplifies the issue on just the level that really doesn't allow us to progress or move forward in our discussion of African American English. So the kind of view that we have of African American English is one along these lines. It's not informal general English. It's a system. General American English is a system. And there's overlap. So I'm using tense and aspect, some fancy terms here at the top, just to talk about the way that African American English marks events. African American English has a system of talking about habitual events, has a system of talking about the very far past that differs from the system of general English. Yet there's overlap. There are things that both of these systems do the very same way. But you'll see that in both of these diagrams, there are areas that are not shared. And that's what we want to know. There are ways of producing negation kinds of structures and placing focus on the negation kinds of structures in African American English that's not shared with General English, although they do share some of the same kinds of patterns. Okay? And in forming questions, we see also that there are similar ways of forming questions in both African American English and General English. We can simply just take one little element and put it in a different position and form a question. So I can say, I can read that book. Okay? If I wanted to ask a question, I just need to locate can, put it to the front, and I can say, can I read that book? That's the question. We do that in both African American English and General English. But there's also a way in African American English to produce questions with specific intonational patterns precisely at the end of the sentence. So I was talking to teachers in Springfield, Massachusetts, and one of the teachers said, you know, wait a minute. When a student in my class says to me, hey coach, I can use the restroom? I say to him, I don't know, can you do that? So I'm thinking, okay, one has to explain that that is a valid yes-no question. I can use the restroom. You can do it with the intonation. You don't have to move can around. And so he said, oh, I didn't know that. I said, yes, now you know that. So there are indeed some differences. And you can indicate questions in General English with the rise in intonation. Often speakers may say something like, you know, isn't that, let's see, did you go over there yesterday? So you can have a rise. In African American English, you don't need to have a rise. You can say, you went over there yesterday. You can have something that's not a rise. But speakers understand it as questions. Those speakers who may not be familiar with the variety may take this perhaps to be something that is indeed maybe argumentative or belligerent, but it's not quite the case. Okay. Also, there are different ways of marking certain pragmatic contexts. In many varieties of English, this stressed been is used, but it's not often used preceding a verb that marks the past. So many speakers then can say things like, oh my goodness, oh yes, let's see, oh no, she's been driving that car. To me, she's been driving that car for a long time. But not in many varieties of English can you say something like, oh no, they went to the store. Okay, to me, they went to the store a long time ago. So there's overlap, but there are unique kinds of patterns that occur in African American English. And then if you're not quite certain about the rules, then you may not understand the meaning. So there are a number of differences and similarities that we have to address here. Okay? So now then, one point that we want to make in addition to this point about the structure, okay, has to do then with what motivates the dialect. We understand that it's a system. Speakers grow up in certain communities, and then they acquire the language of the community. But then, my goodness, speakers hear then that African American English is not accepted. Why do they continue to use it? Okay? This may very well have something to do with intonation. With identity. So speakers then may use these dialects then maybe to mark a particular region. I'm from South Louisiana, and so that's very clear to some speakers. Speakers then may mark something about their social standing by using dialect. They may use dialect consciously and unconsciously to associate with particular ethnic groups or age groups. And then there may be just something about the individual then that person wants to put forth. And will use the dialect or language to mark that notion. So structure is really very important, but there are a number of other issues that are responsible for motivating this dialect. So now language in the marketplace. So one of the points we make when we're talking about African American English is that, okay, that's variety, I hear it's systematic, but you certainly can't use it in the marketplace or where you're going to conduct business or in academia. And so what we find is that often the variety is used for solidarity among members of a particular group on the one hand, but then it's a very variety that's stigmatized. And what we see here is that there's a clash that somehow has to be resolved for some speakers. So this clash then may come up in school settings, okay? May come up in non-social networks. You want to speak your variety, but then maybe you've determined not to use it in non-social networks. Okay? May also be the case that this is a variety that you identify with, but you're not going to use it in employment situations. And then also, you may use it to avoid negative kinds of attitudes. But these then are choices that speakers can make. Not all speakers then can make these choices, because speakers are at different places on the continuum. Some speakers might like to use another code, another variety, but maybe they're not linguistically able to do that. Maybe they don't understand what all the subtle differences are between, say, African American English and mainstream or standard English. And we really see that happening. We really see that happening in a number of different places. What we have to notice here then is that speakers who are basically speakers of African American English, other dialects, have a different system, and General English is yet another dialect. So we have dialects A and not dialects B. There are real differences between the two. We don't have a situation in which we have an incorrect way of producing a construction and a correct way. We have differences, two different dialects. In one dialect, in order to talk about something that usually happens, you might choose to use an uninflected or non-conjugated B. She'd be reading too fast. Okay, I can say that of this woman here who's not reading at the moment. I may know that only because I've observed her on more than 2 occasions that she reads just too fast. And I can only say it after having observed those instances, because now it's become a habit. But in another dialect, we might choose to say she usually reads too fast. Okay? So now the verb is no longer in the progressive, it's in the simple tense, and we have an adverbial there, usually. In this particular variety, he was steady reading. Okay? We might say, by using the marker steady, in dialect B, you might choose to say, he was reading intensely and consistently. And in using that particular variety, what you note now is that in using dialect A, the marker steady precedes the verb. But in dialect B, now you note that these adverbs intensely and consistently can follow the verb. So here, when we're talking about one dialect and another, it's not just a matter of deleting things and adding things in. We really have to know systems, and we need to know rules, such as where then do these adverbs occur with respect to the verb. Speakers know these kinds of things. So the point here then is that we don't want to be too quick to say, oh my goodness, this person is speaking ungrammatical English because he's used something from dialect A. But we certainly can talk about what's ungrammatical. So let me give you some examples here. Okay. So it may very well be that speakers who have made the choice, okay, to somehow move from one particular variety to another then may not have observed all of the subtle differences. And we can see when that begins to happen. Often we see some markers of African American English in what is purported mainstream English. And this is sort of camouflage African American English, because we're not quite clear what the subtle differences are between African American English and mainstream English. So you could hear the following sentence: she has been having that car for a long time. So now what the speaker has done now is added an auxiliary has. So instead of saying she's been having that car, the speaker now has the auxiliary, she's been having that car, and now when you use the big been, she's been having that car, you don't have to say for a long time, it's already embedded in there. But when you move from the big bin to the little baby bin here, now you have to say for a long time. Otherwise, I don't know you mean that. But what we see here is the verb having after been. And we know that in General American English or Standard English, that's a kind of verb that doesn't like to occur in the progressive. Okay? So speakers then would say, or in mainstream English, she's had that car for a long time. But in African American English, we love to put these kinds of state verbs in the progressive. We can say she's been having that car. I can say I've been knowing your name. I don't have to say I've known your name. Okay? But in mainstream English, you don't say, I'm knowing your name, Lisa. Okay? Those verbs don't like to be in the ing form, but that's something that speakers really do have to learn in order to move from this particular code to another. We also see, so one lady was relaying to me some information about a retreat, and clearly we were not in the same social networks, and so it was very clear that the goal then was for us to use not our relaxed African American English, not even our formal African American English, but our goal was to move from that code or system to another code. So she said of the minister, he won't let us wear pants, and he doesn't even be there. So again here, doesn't says, okay, look at me, I'm standard. I'm agreeing, you have a he singular, you have a doesn't singular, everything is in agreement, because we all know in African American English, there's no real overt singular agreement. He don't let us wear pants is what you might get. But what we have here still is this B marker that means something like usually, and he isn't usually there. But this marker indicates such strong meaning. In order to produce a comparable sentence in mainstream English, you have to say something a little awkward. Okay? So here then, what we have is camouflage African American English and purported mainstream English. And this indeed is incorrect mainstream English. So in this case, we can talk about incorrect or ungrammatical language, because the target here is not African American English, the target is mainstream American English. So now then, there are ways to talk about this. I mean, we're now beginning, maybe we can move forward in this whole study of African American English if we're more explicit about notions of shifts or shifting. So in the last slide, what we actually saw then was an example of a speaker who at least took steps to move from one code to another code. Okay? And so it may very well be then that in the educational systems, teachers are now more concerned with code shifting. If they're interested in the language that students are using in the marketplace or where business is being conducted, maybe the goal is to say, okay, you're a speaker of this systematic variety, but maybe you will want to code shift, move from one variety to another. When I say code shift here, I really mean moving from one code, African American English, to a totally different code, mainstream English. Okay? So now, we have to ask a number of questions though. Can this code shifting be acquired? Is it just acquired the way we acquire languages in general? Is it sort of learned unconsciously the way we learn languages? I think so. People develop as code shifters. The question though really is, can it be taught? It's not quite clear that you teach code shifting. Now you may make people aware of where shifts might take place, and you may give them the necessary information that might be needed to use a particular construction that's comparable in the two varieties, but actual teaching of code shifting, it's not quite clear how one actually does that. But now, what we have to remember in talking about this shifting, and we don't want to just get things all mushed up together because they're really very different. So there are different levels of shifting. One level of shifting is shifting within the dialect. So we can shift within African American English. So I grew up as a native speaker of African American English. That variety is variable. We have different ways of saying the same thing as other speakers do in other languages. The other shifting that we're talking about is shifting across dialects, changing codes. So it may very well be that for speakers to become code shifters takes more effort, more knowledge about different languages. Shifting within African American English is automatic. You basically acquired these different ways of doing things. Okay? So I want to give some examples of this shifting. So what you see here basically is a continuum. So you see the red area indicating African American English, and as it goes to the end, white, mainstream English, just random kinds of colors here. But what I want to suggest is that in the first column, these are all constructions that speakers of African American English would use. Okay? So the first one, she reading, no overt B form there. So a speaker on one occasion could say she reading. On another occasion, the speaker, even 5 minutes later, could say she's reading. Okay? And within African American English, both of those exist. Okay, so if I talk to you and if you say, my goodness, where's your sister? I might say, oh, she's reading. Then you walk over there and talk to Ursula and you come back and you say, oh, I forgot. Where's your sister? Okay, I could say she's reading this time. And then you might say, oh, you just code shifted into mainstream English. No, I didn't. I'm still in African American English. Both of those forms are in African American English. There are B forms. But it may very well be the case that, and you can go to work by, look at work by Michael Terry. I think we're beginning to have some evidence for this. If we look at a construction as a number 2, she reads. Oh, she read a lot, my goodness. Now, that structure is used by speakers of African American English. But speakers then may not say she reads as often as they might say she's reading. It may very well be that this tiny third singular marker is something that's more closely associated with mainstream American English than African American English. So it may very well be the case that when a speaker says she reads is in African American English and she reads is in mainstream English. So if I tell this lady again, oh, do you know my sister, she read a lot. She may go and talk to Ursula and then she comes back, she said, what did you say? I might say, my sister read a lot. No change there. I'm probably more likely to keep she read, which is really a part of my variety. So then if we're thinking in terms of making something of this shifting, we ought to understand that there seem to be a number of levels of shifting. So speakers, when shifting, are not automatically leaving the variety, but in some cases they might be. So speakers can say they be walking too fast. What did you say? You know, they usually walk too fast. Both of those constructions could very well be in African American English. And the last one, oh my goodness, that's his sister book. It may very well be the case that this marker of possession, the possessive S, okay, is also something that's more closely associated with mainstream English and shifting from his sister book, which also indicates the book that's owned by the sister, to his sister's book, may actually involve shifting from one code, African American English, to another code. So we're going to move this study of the variety forward then and talk about something like shifting, then we ought to understand that it actually happens on different levels. So now what I'm going to do just in the last few minutes here is talk about just what it means for children to acquire this variety. Okay? So here then, I want to bring out this point because I think once we begin to study acquisition and how children develop African American English as their native variety, then we can move forward. We're used to talking about African American English sort of as something that's used by adolescents, young adults, but what about young children? By the time they hit, pre-kindergarten classes, they're really well on their way to developing these particular systems. And then when they're in the 4th grade, we want to now get out our instruction and say, oh my goodness, what wonderful instruction can we use? Now the children are in 4th grade. What happened to the other instruction for the earlier grades? So now, what I'd like to point out here then is that in African American English, as we've already seen, this unconjugated B is used, and it's used. Yeah, you have to pay attention now. It's used to indicate something that's habitual, we'll say, something that usually occurs, okay? So here's the experiment that we used with 4- and 5-year-olds. We wanted to determine whether or not 4- and 5-year-olds actually understood this marker as marking something about something that usually happens or something that happens from time to time, or whether or not they just think of this marker as just a regular is, something that's happening now. So here's the scenario. So just look at, so I'll just point out to you and you'll hear it in a little bit. If you look at the first frame, you see the little character Faye riding her bike. In the second frame, she's riding her bike. In the third frame, she's riding her bike. And in the fourth frame, she's walking to school because now her bike is broken. And then in the very last frame, then on that particular day, she got a ride to school with her Aunt Peggy. So here I'm just going to play a snippet. So you'll hear me reading the scenario, and then you'll hear the response from the 4.5-year-old child.
Today, they get to ride the school because of Ed Petty. Look at Ed Petty wants to show her a new car, so today she gets to ride the school with Ed Petty. But how does they begin in school? Riding a bike. Really? Every day she rides a bike. You like it too? You ride a bike too? Yeah. Right. She rides there walking to school. Okay.
Okay, so here we have really very clear evidence that this child who is 4.5 really understands this aspect will be as some kind of marker that indicates something that usually happens. So the child chose riding the bike as opposed to how does she be getting to school as opposed to going in the car. So we have evidence that children, at least by 4.5, are beginning to acquire this marker. They don't have it, perfectly at this point, but they're beginning to acquire it at that particular age. So then you have to understand, children are acquiring this habitual marker, but they're also acquiring other kinds of auxiliaries. That's a good bit to know for a young child. So I'll just summarize some of the other work with the children, just to give you an idea about their developmental systems. So many of you have heard this new use of had, okay, that occurs among speakers of African Americans, and it was reported for pre-adolescents, but we have evidence that kids who are 4 are acquiring this preterite had. So when acquiring this pre-verbal had. When I talk about this had, what I'm talking about is a had that occurs with a verb that may or may not be marked for past tense, but it refers to something prior. So we know that in mainstream English we can use had plus a verb. I had eaten by the time she arrived. That means then that my eating basically took place farther in the past than the arrival, okay? But we hear examples of this had in ways that are not like that, okay? So you might hear a person saying, my phone had rung when you called, okay? It could mean that my phone rang right at the moment you're calling. It doesn't mean then that the phone rang farther in the past. What we see then is that children produce this particular had. It's very interesting because if we look at children who are developing English, we know that they don't develop the past perfect at 4, but they do develop this particular had. So we gave children narratives and we asked them to retell the story to see if they would use the had. So here is just a snippet. So in the story, Good Dog Carl, I don't know if you can see that very well. The dog Carl was left in charge of the baby, and the mother said, I'm going out, Carl, watch the baby. So he watched the baby. They had just a great time. Carl thought he might turn on some music, and then they would dance. And so children were very clear. When they were describing an event that was ongoing, they often used the progressive. So children would say something like, he was dancing, because Carl was really in the middle of dancing. But then when they talked about other events, they used just the past. And then they say something like, and then he had turned on the music radio and was dancing. Okay? And so here we see now turn on seems to be an event that is accomplished and over. And so I won't go through the data, but if we sort of just look through the data, you can see the underlying ways of marking the past. You see the children are using this had. And what I want to suggest is that they're using the had precisely in context where an event seems to have been accomplished or achieved. Okay. So now what I want to do in summarizing here is say that, okay, let's see if we can take this African American English to another level and stop spinning our wheels and sort of just rehashing old kinds of views. So what I'm proposing here is a kind of direct model. If we're taking this sort of shifting into consideration, we have to take it into consideration, though, with children who are acquiring this variety as their native variety. It's not clear that when kids come to school at 5, we want to say, okay, I'm going to teach little Johnny to code shift. That, I think, would be extremely problematic. But if one of your goals then is to provide more language and linguistic experiences for the child, then it's necessary to understand some of the patterns that the child actually brings to school as part of his or her variety. So the kind of model that I have here basically has a number of components. At the outset, what we have to do is define African American English as an inherently variable variety that has patterns and systems of temporal markers, for example, time markers like the beat, markers that are used to talk about the event. Also, we want to identify this particular variety as something then that is used quite systematically. So we want to talk more about these verbal markers, for example, the beat and the had, as markers that are used to talk about the way events are completed. What we find about African American English is that for some reason speakers then seem to like pre-verbal markers more so than they like suffixes. So whereas you won't find many third singular S's on verbs, a suffix, you'll often find a pre-verbal marker like pre-verbal had, pre-verbal be, pre-verbal been. There's some kind of attraction to these grammaticalized or pre-verbal kinds of markers that encode information. Then we want to recognize African American English as rule governed here and understand in the marketplace that it's not haphazard language use. It's not mainstream English use with mistakes. It's a separate variety. We want to educate speakers and non-speakers about this particular variety. So when we talk about had as a pre-verbal marker, we want to put it within the whole system of the way speakers begin to talk about events and time. And we want to note that this marker indicates the accomplishment or achievement of an event. And we want to kind of create an environment for the understanding. So if children then we're taking our new direction of African American English, now looking at acquisition, we need to understand that children acquire this variety as their native variety. It's their first variety. And so given that, they may use these pre-verbal markers in past tense contexts, in habitual kinds of contexts. And then we also want to transition to a kind of awareness that speakers are aware of different dialects, different varieties. Okay? African American English and other varieties of English can express the same concepts by using different strategies. They can mark in events, okay? But they can express the same concepts. We can also apply this model to code shifting. So preterite had in the past, those are in African American English. Speakers can say, you know, my phone had rung, or they can simply say my phone rung to mean the same thing. But now we also have to talk about this third singular S in this direct model. We also have to have a way of talking about moving not just within African American English, but moving from African American English to mainstream English. And so we can do this by talking about third singular S. So we want to talk about then speakers somehow making all verbs the same. Instead of picking out verbs that occur with singular subjects, okay, he likes cake, and then sort of turning around and using a different form with the plural subject, they like cakes, speakers simply just neutralize the whole paradigm. Let's use one verb form for singular and plural. No overt marking, at least in these contexts. Maybe this third singular S has other kinds of meaning too. But that's what we really need to know, get at, to sort of move this agenda on African American English forward. Okay, so I want to close here with just the summary. So basically here, what I want to note is that we can begin to move our study of African American English forward. So next year, you won't have to say 2011. We're doing the same thing we did in 1990, 1980, 1970, 1960s. We can now engage in a theoretical and descriptive sort of research study of child's African American English, talking about how children acquire this particular variety. Note the kinds of systems that children are developing early. How could we discuss curricula in education without actually knowing what's happening at the early stages in African American English? Then we can now begin to maybe move from some of these structural notions about the language to motivation, dialect motivation. Why then, after all of these hundreds of years, are we still talking about African American English? Why do speakers still talk like that? Well, We can talk about identity networks, how language is used to convey thoughts, but it's also used to convey information about ourselves. And then finally, we can now take this discussion even further and talk about education and the marketplace. What kind of language use then are we talking about with respect to educational environments? What kind of language use are we talking about in the marketplace? What are implications for these particular components when we study African American English? And in talking about these issues, then we want to talk about intra-dialects, intra-switching, that is switching within the dialect, using variables within the dialect, but we also then want to begin to talk about what happens or what speakers need to know to move across dialects, from one dialect to the other. What speakers need to know for actual dialect or coaching. Thank you.
Sure. Questions? Any questions from the audience?
I have one.
Go right
Oh,
ahead.
yeah. Oh, this is my friend. You can ask all the questions you'd like.
I cannot figure out, I produce poetry slams. I cannot figure out why one group that disproportionately fails standardized tests of reading in the public school excel with the spoken word, without script, memorized, with gestures and everything. And they're so superb, not to mention the spin-offs in rap.
Absolutely, yes.
Now, why?
Yeah, that's right. You absolutely, absolutely. I think. Oh, I'm sorry. Would you repeat your question?
Yeah. When you look at standardized tests, which called No Child Left Behind, validates the school or invalidates the school, the population that fails those standard tests, the group are black males, African American males. 4 out of 5 flunk the test of reading. Now, pick them up 5, 10, 15 years later at a poetry slam on HBO Def Jam Poets on Broadway. And they'll get on there and geniuses, no script, run the mind, you know, very articulate, very deep story content. Now, I want to know why, what happened? Why couldn't they do well in the early grades? And what, is there something happening here within things that you said?
That's an excellent point, and I think too it would be nice if we could pin all of what's happening on language. If we could do that, we could really deal with it. But I think a number of other issues are involved there. Attitudes towards, in the school system, attitudes towards behavior, attitudes towards kinds of language. But two, so that's one issue. But the part that has to do with language, I really do think that there are some subtle differences between, for example, the kinds of language that these speakers use and the kinds of language that's accepted in standardized tests in academia. Those differences are very subtle, and if they're not pointed out, then they just sort of go over these speakers' heads. And then they don't get the necessary kinds of skills in using language, in interpretation and comprehension that they might need to be successful on the standardized tests. But that's just one component. The other has to do with attitudes and all of those other kinds of issues. But you're right, so that's why I really think it's important to, if we're sort of dealing with just a slice of this issue with respect to language, it really is very important for us to understand sort of developmentally what children are acquiring, what kinds of language they actually bring to school, if we're going to address this. So I think there are a number of very, very important aspects of that, which may have to do with attitudes, what goes on in the classroom, why are these students in special education even, why are they taken out of class? But with the language issue, I think there are real subtle differences that really have to be taught. They're not taught. We don't have enough people with skills in African American English. People say, I can speak it, but who can teach it? You know, who can teach speakers who use this particular variety what the subtle differences are between their variety and language in academia?
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I heard, definitely informative, but also a sense of advocacy for the acceptance of the informal and informal. With young Caucasians, the youth, with them using African American English, do you think that is going to help with the sense of advocacy of?
Yeah, I love the point you're making here. I don't really take it as a question, I take it as a point here. But we can really sort of see the different levels of African American English when we look at the way it's appropriated by youth from different groups. And often then when they sort of appropriate this African American English, they really are limited to just a particular part. And often that part has to do with slang elements, words. They really don't get too far into the grammar. But given that notion of appropriation, I think it's accepted in contexts that it hasn't been accepted in. The other thing, too, is that we know that the use of African American English says something about how you want to identify yourself. Maybe you want to be cool. Maybe you want to be manly. Not quite sure. But given the appropriation, we see that it's used in a number of different contexts than broadly. Yeah.
Dr. Green, I too enjoyed the presentation because I had some issues that I'm wrestling with.
Okay, oh, wrestler. Okay.
So dynamic.
A wrestler.
Issues in my mind. I think you did mention in your book, African American English and Introduction to Language.
I'm impressed.
Yes, I read it. I don't get much services. I'm wrestling with, in your book, you constantly alluded to African American English being a variety of English, and this sort of bothered me because
Yes.
I'm influenced by the anthropologists,
Yes.
linguists, and I think you mentioned in your book, this is the thing that you mentioned, I can't think of his name, but he talks about the derivation of Black English.
Right, oh yes.
Yeah, and I noticed in your presentation you didn't go into
Right.
that, which you can't do it all at the short period
Right,
of time.
good.
I understand that. But there seem to be scholars who have stated if we don't append something with Africa to the African language, then you're almost saying that the Black people don't have a
Right, okay, good.
cultural language or what have you. And I was wondering how you feel about that.
Very okay, yes.
You didn't,
Yes.
there is a language system in West African languages that differ from English.
Yes, okay, yes, and I appreciate that, but that point, you guys weren't asking questions, you're sort of getting me told in that's just a very nice way, but I like that. But here's my issue with the historical research. What we understand, I'm very, very serious about work on African American English, as I choose to call it. What I understand as a linguist is that when we begin to talk about historical language, when we talk about origins of language, when we try to go back and trace the language, we have to get deep down and dirty. And it's logical to make a connection, of course, between African Americans and African languages, given the history. Unfortunately, we haven't done the systematic research to show that. And that's what we need to be about. If it is indeed the case that African American English, for example, is aspect prominent in the way it talks about events, and there's some connection to West African languages, different languages, we need to get down and do the research to show that. It's not enough for us to say, you know, this is intuitive, this must have happened naturally. That only goes so far. We really have to take it seriously the way we take study of other language. And so that's why I really don't focus a great deal on the origin, because I haven't done the systematic research to make those claims. And so what I do try to show is that it doesn't, I can call it, which is what I do in my course. I begin by calling it X. You can call it anything, but what you end up with is a system. And now, whether or not this system shares patterns with English, and which it actually does, we also see that it differs. But we haven't done the serious research, and I think it's very serious. This is why we haven't moved forward in the study of African American English. We haven't done the serious research to really talk about the connections in the way we need to do so.
But you don't consider Clinton,
Which were you talking about, Dillard?
now Clinton,
Clinton?
Crawford's book, Ebonics, Language of the
Oh, Ebonics, yes, oh yes.
I'm impressed with that research that's done in that text by African scholars who I think have done a serious study and have given us background information where did Ebonics or Black English, whatever appellation you want to call it, where did it come from? And those guys and ladies have, I think, done impressive research about where these language patterns come from. And they give you
You hit the right word, pattern. You hit the right word, pattern. Thank you for bringing up pattern.
Patterns, right, yeah.
I'm from New Orleans. Let me give you, it comes through the music. It goes back to the oldie shots of the West Side. Shango has a pattern. Iman Jah has a pattern. All of the oldie shots have pattern. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, that's Shango. We could get 5 musicians in New Orleans, never played together, never rehearsed, go out and play for 2.5 hours without a sheet of music, and everybody had a good time. Pattern. The leader would say, B-flat shuffle, ice cream on the bridge, and we go. Pattern.
But it's that's good. That's good. And good. I understand your point. Good. I understand your point. But I think we really have to sort of. There are a number of hypotheses out there. But what we need to see are real documents. So we need to go back to early ex-slave narratives. I'm not talking about narratives, the literary narratives, but we need to go back to WP8, the collections. We need to look at data. We can piece things together, and it can make sense. But we need to have data spoken from the mouths of African Americans. And I think that's the data that we just do not have. And when we're doing the analysis, we just do not have it. But I understand, I appreciate the work of, of people who tried to make these particular claims. But we need systematic data. Yeah. And so that's what we're lacking.
you choose to use African American English as opposed to other applications. I mean, you use Ebonics.
Yeah, I don't use Ebonics. I clearly will never use Ebonics because Robert Williams, when he coined this term, was very clear about what he wanted it to be used for. And he said, look, this particular term is going to be used to refer to all of the varieties, the conglomerations of speakers who have some kind of African descent. And so I couldn't really do that because what I focus on in my analysis, I also focus on the English kind of element. And so it's not quite clear that the variety that I'm explaining, okay, would do justice to what Robert Williams actually talked about. So I think, for me, I put a lot of emphasis on the description of the data, but not so much, what I call it. But I like your point because it suggests that when we name something, okay, that really does go a long way. It could talk about interesting connections. So, right, so I use it, I use the name, but I can call it dialect X, variety X, language X. We're going to have the same kind of systems, patterns, no matter what we call it. But I think, unfortunately, if we go back and we collect all the books on African American English, what we're going to see, if we go to the 1960s, late 50s, starting with Negro non-standard English, Black vernacular English, African American language, Ebonics, we're going to see throughout the period different terminology. But we're not going to see the systematic description that really suggests that this is a rule-governed variety. We see people saying that, and we see people naming it, but we really don't see the work that really does justice to what speakers are actually learning and what they have in their heads as speakers. And that's the part that I focus on. But if you and I can get together, we can come up with the right name and the right description. How about that?
Yeah, I want you, if you can, to say a little bit more. You began by talking a little bit about the relationship between slang and dialect, and I'm not clear on that.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. Because I was thinking, as you said that, about these situations where a term, pardon me, a way of speaking about it, something that's fairly common in dialect, then becomes slang. And where something that initiates itself or becomes initiated as a slang term becomes part of the dialect. So, for example, I was thinking of something like baby mama, which is fairly common. It's a fairly common terminology in dialect. But it also now has become kind of a slang. In fact, it's get moving.
Yes.
Based on that kind of thing. Or when someone asks you about a woman and they say, well, she'd be slamming, and which is a dialectical term, but it also has moved to slang. So I'm wondering if there is a fairly fluid passage back and forth,
Okay.
or are there rules that tell us when it really is a set part of dialect as opposed to simply a slang term now?
Okay, good. So here's a simple answer, and unfortunately I have to give you a longer version too, but here's the simple answer. All varieties, languages, dialects have a slang component. So the baby mama drama could be in the slang component of African American English. All right. So when I went to University of Massachusetts as a graduate student and did some TAing, the white children would say, "It's wicked cold out there," and I thought, "Oh, I'm wicked? What does that mean?" But that again is a slang element that was not a part of the African American slang component, but it was indeed part of their language. So all of these dialects have slang components. Basically what we're suggesting then is that what we're calling slang is often used by members of that particular group who are in a certain age group. Okay? And so my mother probably would never say baby mom. Okay? My nephew might say that. All right? But if we think in terms of any variety, we find that certain interesting things happen with words. Some of these words may just be unique to the variety, and all speakers of all age groups may use them. And some words may be in that variety and are slang elements. If I said, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe this lady, she's acting so sedity tonight. How dare she?" Who knows what I mean when I say that? I want to see your hands. Oh, you know. Look who knows. Oh, they don't know. Oh, see, these people don't know. Okay, who knows?
It's part of the country.
It's part of the country?
It's part of the country that we're originally
It's a part of the country we're from. Who doesn't know what sedity means? You know sedity. Yes, good. So basically, that's a word that's unique to African American communities. But it's not a slang. My mother would clearly say, "Oh, sedity." My niece, who's 10, probably knows the word. I know it. But my mother doesn't know she wouldn't use baby mama. Okay? But that's also a unique term associated with that particular group. So there's a slang component that's used by members of a particular group, often of a particular age group. But there are other words like sedity, like kitchen. I'm saying, "Oh, my hair is, not where I want it. You have to take care of the kitchen." Who knows what that means? Oh, see, who knows? So these words are not slang words per se because they cross generational boundaries. My mother clearly knows, who's 79, knows that word. Okay? So they're unique words in all dialects, languages. Some of them are just in the slang component.
Can you now define sedity in the kitchen so everybody...
Oh, yeah, okay. Sedity basically is just another way of saying conceited, okay, or stuck up, or bougie, or stuck up, or uppity. Yes, uppity. Yes. So this lady, I'm just picking on this lady. But we will keep kitchen, ladies. We will keep kitchen to ourselves. How about that? Very good.
white kids
Yes, very good,
speaking slang,
very good.
but they're actually speaking African American dialect.
Okay, this is good. This is precisely her point. Now, for those speakers, I'm a bit rigid, as you see with my discussion with my friend there, or my wrestler. I'm a bit rigid. Of those speakers, what I would say is that they are appropriating certain kinds of elements at that variety. I might say they are maybe attempting to sound black, but I wouldn't say they're speaking African American English. To speak African American English, I think one has to do a bit more than manipulate some common terms. But you're right, they're appropriating certain elements, and these elements seem to be elements associated with, just as you put it, the slang component, the words component. Very
Also
good.
the
But
intonation, the way they.
and that's a bit very good and good. So it depends on the identity. If you want to be cool, then maybe also a kind of intonation. But interesting, an intonation that I wouldn't associate with my father, who's a Native American, African American English speaker, but maybe some young group. Good.
One more question.
Yes, sir.
You did all this talk about
All
African
this talk.
English, not defining things.
Okay, African American. Oh, this is, yes, very good. African American English. Remember, I said the definition that I gave up there was the one that I was going to work with. African American English is a system that has set patterns of word formation. Okay, patterns of putting sounds together. Patterns then of putting words together to form sentences. So it's a variety or language system that has patterns of syntax, phonology for sounds, semantics for meaning, pragmatics for the way we use meanings. But it's a variety that overlaps with general English in interesting kinds of ways also.
So taking that definition into consideration, how then classroom teachers to address, operate, because you're wondering, can it be taught? Yeah, that was the question.
At least can code switching be taught?
Okay, so when young children come into classrooms, how then, and when we think of where the kids are failing, it's the academic language that they're failing.
Absolutely.
Because they have the vernacular.
Absolutely.
So the question is, how are classroom teachers,
Yes.
do they need to understand these structures, syntax, semantics before they can make this switch?
So this is what I suggest, and I mean, what
Lisa,
the world...
can you repeat the question because the people...
Oh, okay, so here's an educator on some level. So here, the educator said, you know, all right, now you have your fancy definition. Really, what are teachers to do with this? Okay? So basically, the last thing the world needs is another requirement for teachers. But what we must say then, given some of the research we've seen in reading language arts, then it really is beneficial for students to understand some very subtle differences between their native variety and the academic language. And unfortunately, teachers then are only going to be able to sort of facilitate this sort of use of academic language on some levels if they understand the differences. So if little Johnny says, oh, Miss Brown, I'd be too tired to do my work. You know, Miss Brown probably wouldn't want to say, I said in here, none of that talk. What you actually mean is, Miss Brown, I am too tired to do my work. But that's not what he means. Okay? So it really is necessary to have some kind of understanding of how this particular variety actually works systematically. Teachers then might not want to learn African American English, but it's important to learn that African American English places emphasis on preverbal markers as opposed to the ends of words. So speakers might say, I turned around yesterday, instead of I turned around yesterday. Or they might say, I had turned around. So teachers then might want to know what some of these patterns are. So there are a number of handbooks that might be useful, but they need to understand that these are patterns and systems. So, you know, if I see this in writing, it may not be useful for me to mark an X every time the student does this. But maybe the teacher can see, oh, this child does this in all instances. This must be a pattern. How can we work on just this one pattern? So look at it as patterns and not just a smattering of mistakes. That's what I can offer.
Do you see this as becoming acceptable for purposes like a dissertation?
Oh, wait.
If I write a dissertation and I say I've been studying all day, am I going to be laughed out of school 2 years from now, or am I going to?
If you do it, are you as a speaker of African American English?
Anyone. If anyone, if
But
I
okay, yeah.
take the time and construct a paper with African American English and then turn it in as my dissertation,
Yeah, I'm
can
not.
I expect, regardless of who that person is, and they may know, I mean, my English teacher currently requires a pseudonym on every paper, so she doesn't know
Yeah.
who's turned it in. Is this going, at some point, should this become acceptable?
I mean, the situation you give me is an interesting one, but I can't really understand how to think about it, because when we think in terms of African American English and all the people who are doing research on that particular variety, what we understand is that there are very few people who can teach it. So in the dissertation process, what you actually go through are just revisions and revisions. So in order for you to get to a stage at which you turn in a dissertation in African American English, you and your advisor have to be engaged in this particular variety such that you know the rhetorical strategies of it and you know how to use it appropriately. And so I'm just not sure where that advisor would be. So it's not quite clear how you would ever turn this in. And speakers, I as a native speaker of African, you will never hear me speak African American English unless I want you to. So speakers of native speakers of African American English who have actually written dissertations, never think twice about writing in this particular variety. No one is suggesting that we want to. The only person I know who can really do this with ease is Geneva Smitherland. And she publishes many books, and you can go to her books and know the way she moves in and out of African American language, as she calls it. But I get from your question, which is what I like more, is that you are raising the question about, really, this may be fine and good. It may be systematic and rule governed, but how far is it going to get us? I'm not a native African American English speaker because I want to write my dissertation in it. I'm a native African American English speaker because just like you grew up in a particular community that spoke a certain way, I grew up in a particular community that spoke a certain way. I understood very early on, one taught me to code switch, I understood very early on that I had two at least ways of speaking. Nothing was wrong with either, okay? They were used in different kinds of settings. And I had to learn some of these subtle differences. So it's not that anybody is trying to teach African American English. I bet you couldn't get 3 people together who could do it. And you certainly couldn't find a dissertation advisor who would work diligently to help you use the rhetorical strategies and all the nuances of African American English. But it is a fact. Speakers use this particular variety not because they're trying to make a point, not because they're trying to say, I'm going to use it in the mainstream, and now I want to write my dissertation. They use it because that's their method of communication. And if the goal then is to get these speakers to use a particular variety that's accepted in the marketplace, in the mainstream, they can do that. But in some instances, things just have to be taught. Some speakers, mainstream English speakers who grew up with it as their varieties, had to learn that you shouldn't write if I had this, okay? Right, had I or something, okay? So those are just rules you had to learn. And so speakers also have to learn other kinds of rules. So the dissertation question is an interesting one. I don't know where that would ever happen, but I don't think in any kinds of school systems people are going to accept the writing in that particular variety or vernacular, maybe for plays or something along those lines. But we're very clear, children are clear, that the language of the marketplace of education is what it is accepted. It's just that not all speakers can hear the differences between their African American English and mainstream English. And for those speakers, just teach them overtly. These are the differences. That's all.
mean, I hear you say that.
Before you talk, let's do this. We have two more questions. All right. We have your question, and then is anyone else? Then we'll come back to yours, and then we'll end there. So let's do this. Let her go. Did you still have a question? Okay. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for coming.
I would like to say, in response to the educator's question, that I would suggest that the frontline defense at this point is actually to get acceptance of it as a formal way of speaking. As you have suggested, a different way of speaking, but a formal way of speaking, because what I find to be the biggest problem is that students are made to feel less than because they are speaking that language. And I think that if we start there, it'd be much easier to try to move to point B than just jumping in and, you know, this is wrong, this is not how you speak. But, you know, even teaching our students that it is a valid way of speaking. It's a different way of speaking, but a valid way of speaking.
I like this point, after my own heart, because what we have to do in order to show that it's valid is that we really have to show what rules are. Speakers, then, you can produce an ungrammatical African-American English sentence, just like you can produce an ungrammatical mainstream English sentence, if you don't follow the rules. So we have to follow the rules. This is why this gentleman's question is important, because you can't just say, oh, I have a dissertation in African-American English. It has to be written in certain rules. And so you're right. We have to spend more time describing and showing what the rules are. And when my 4-year-olds speak this variety, they know they have to go to school and understand mainstream English, but they are also acquiring another variety. That's a big burden on children, and not to understand that these children know a good bit about different ways of marking, for example, habitual events, I think is just really just suggesting that we have strong attitudes, negative attitudes about language that are not based on any kind of research.
Can I just
So I
get
like that
clarity?
point.
Are you saying children, or are you saying college-age students
Which ones?
in acceptance in the classroom?
Oh, I know. So here's what I do. I'm not in the classroom. I'm at the university. I can close my door and do research. So I would never tell a teacher what she or he should do in the classroom. I think what she was quoting was that I said it's not a wrong way or an incorrect way of speaking. It's a different way of speaking. And so children who are 4 or 5 are already acquiring this different way of speaking. So they go to school. Yeah, they go to school already with this variety. Yes.
Because I teach here in Carolina, and I have African-American students.
Right.
I just want to make sure that I hear you. You're not saying encourage the African-American students to use African-American English.
Oh, yeah.
Amongst it. There might be 1 or 2, and I understand the negativity aspect. You don't want
I
them
wasn't
to feel.
feeling that either.
No.
I never say anything about encouraging or suggesting. I think that's way beyond my scope of what I can do and tell people. But I'm just making it clear that if speakers are using it, just know it's rule governed. But sort of, you understand. Maybe you know some African American English, but you're not speaking it, and you know this. Okay, and we need to give everybody that opportunity to use different kinds of things.
You know what bothers me, though, when you say acceptance? 2 former secretaries of state, Alexander Haig, spoke perfect standard English. But compare him to Henry Kissinger, who had a thick accent, who was hard, who was a brain. I always understood Kissinger. I didn't agree with it half the time, but I never could understand anything Haig said.
Yeah.
Case closed.
Yeah, we won't comment.
Let's let this gentleman go first, and then you will be the absolute last question, okay?
Okay, well, I was just going in, we were talking about acceptance, and I think a good way to look at it, maybe that's the next step as far as advocacy for African American English within like the education system would be this term uses cultural judicium, where if you're aware of a lot of times when you try to advocate for something, you're going against the opposition and this structure in place. But if we look at it more in terms of, okay, well, these are rules in place, how can we put this into academia and notice the differences in between the two, and then kind of in jiu-jitsu you shift the weight of your opponent to where you want it to go. So that would be another opportunity for that.
Right, good opportunities, but it's always very important to understand that, when we take these steps, we really have to have qualified people who are able to do this. That means that educators may need to be taught something about African American English. What worries me is that in some instances, anything goes. Oh, write in your dialect. And a child might write something, but you don't have the opportunity to get correction in your African American English. And so that, I think, good opportunity, but we definitely need the training. Very good, I like that.
So you had the last comment here, and then we'll end up.
We're talking about getting this language style in the classroom to be more acceptable.
So I haven't said what should be accepted. My thing is that whatever decision you make in the classroom, just know that this variety is going on. That's my.
Let me speak from the layman's point of view, and experiences I've had as a former teacher. Most teachers, especially African American teachers, when you talk about this language variety, they close you out.
Yes.
They do not want to hear it. Many of us, when we get our degrees, we get upper class, we turn our backs on some things. And that's a challenge to get black teachers in particular to come down from the Eiffel Tower, not to come down, but to put into their bags of tricks, what we call it, that information that you're giving that would be more helpful in the classroom. It would, I would predict, if teachers were trained in this mode of thinking and understanding our language, that the student scores would go up.
Yes.
The students would probably be more proud. Because you see, this is the thing for many black kids, is that ethnic identity is how to bring it out. They're very proud of that, and they're not changing it. They're not going to change it. They don't need to change it. It communicates. That's what language does. But I submit that we need to give teachers a good dose of this, because if not, as you said, if we don't know it, then we can't teach it. If we don't know it, we're going to continue to correct. This is wrong. This is wrong.
Right.
And another thing we're talking about is power. We have to talk about power.
Absolutely.
Language is power.
Absolutely.
And some people don't want us to get that power, because that means we can compete.
Very good. I know you're somebody famous. I haven't figured that out. But very nice. Excellent point. So this is a good note to end on. So we've really been taught to think of African American English as general English or mainstream English with mistakes. And basically we only evaluate it by using negative attitudes. But once we understand it, even people who grew up speaking it but have distanced themselves from it, once we understand the systems and the rules that actually sort of go along with it, you're right, that may help us make a dent in some of these test scores and some of the other issues. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for everyone coming out. I also want people to be very, very aware that the Stone Center really provided the venue for Dr. Green. It was the Department of Linguistics that really went out and encouraged her, invited her, and made sure that she made it down here. So I also want you to give the Department of Linguistics a round of applause. So I want to give you time to talk with her before she leaves. Congratulate her on that wonderful PowerPoint. And I know you have a few more things you want to ask before we get out.
Thank you. And I've got to meet my friends, my educator, and my city lady here.
And those who really want to know what kitchen is, meet me in the back.